of security protection requires the closest type of organization and coordination is a problem. On the other side of that, and I'm getting to the end of my talk here, the other side of that is the notion that from time to time, broad issues that have great importance and that have a long half-life might well be carried out following a pattern that's been used rarely but sometimes importantly of creating an executive committee or a task force of the National Security Council to carry them out. A very good friend of mine did one on Bosnia in the Balkans. I did one on Plan Colombia. Others have done them on other sections. President Kennedy used an ExComm in lieu of having to be just the cabinet in dealing with the consequences of the discovery of nuclear weapons in Cuba and Soviet delivery vehicles. And I think this is an important pattern. It shouldn't be done for everything, and can't be, but it's a way of bringing the processes together. And those who are chosen to lead those particular task forces have a particular responsibility. They no longer are operating in purely their departmental mode. They have to be blessed, if I can put it this way, at least by the National Security Advisor, but also the secretary for whom they work. And that can happen and can be useful. One measure of success is once again tying the money to the mouth. And task forces often are successful if in fact it is early understood. A, it's going to cost big money. B, it's not going to come out of departmental and agency budgets. And that's significant. I would say 2 or 3 other things I think need to be looked at. One is how legal advice is given. And we've seen a process that unfortunately, particularly over the 2003 Iraq invasion, where legal advice was given in a narrow circle closely tied to the White House policy people. And this was not, in my view, that kind of success. The notion that the Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department has a preeminent role, but so do the major legal advisors in the associated departments and agencies. This isn't a public process, but it should not be so private that it leads to a small group, in fact, authorizing, endorsing things that on the one hand are clearly not going to pass legal tests, but on the other hand are devised purely to promote a single policy solution, and that's significant. And then finally, I would say that in the period in which administrations change, it is obviously of extreme importance to the incoming administration to be able to do things both at once. Number one is to choose its own people and to put them in place as soon as it can. But number two, not be so unstrung by a wholesale replication of staff on the one hand, and by the fact that normally the whole document trove of the predecessor is bundled up and goes to the presidential library. And there's a simple way of doing this. One, and it's being done a little better from administration to administration, unlike other aspects of National Security Council operations. And this is to provide both briefings and copies of the critical documents, and to suggest that a certain number of professional people with real backgrounds stay on from administration to administration. Professionals are genuinely believed and supposed to be, and I hope they are, it was certainly my view, able to serve presidents of different parties over different periods of time, and to do so on the basis that they understand the problem and the issue and can provide ideas for solutions that are significant. I'm sorry I've taken so much time, but it's something that's close to my heart. It's closely tied to General Scowcroft in every sense of the word. If there was a kind of gold standard, I think everybody tends to look at his administration of his 2 national security councils as perhaps as close to that as anybody can get. Thank you.
Thank you for those very, everybody hear me? Does this microphone work? I guess raise your hand if you can't. If you can't hear me, you know, that doesn't work, does it?
You won't be able to raise your hand.
Right, exactly. A few years ago, Ivo Daalder and I published a book about presidential national security advisors, in which we looked at 7 of them intensively, Brent Scowcroft being one. To give the book a little pizzazz, we decided to give quotations for the title of each chapter. For the Kennedy administration, McGeorge Bundy, we had "You Can't Beat Brains," which was what Kennedy had said about Bundy. We had for the Nixon administration, we had "President in a session, you don't tell anybody," which seemed to be pretty accurate. For Brent Scowcroft, we had a quote attributed to President Bush, and it's a little scary for me to put this forward with him here because maybe he could deny that he said it, but it was basically, Brent doesn't want anything. And in one sense, that is true, and everybody has in a lot of support of this. He doesn't want anything in the sense of personal credit, in the sense of looking at it in terms of where he stands, et cetera, et cetera. But in some sense, that's really very much off the mark, because it seems to me Brent wanted 2 things very badly. One is he wanted a very effective, transparent, trustworthy, and orderly, productive foreign policy process. And secondly, he wanted a realistic, effective foreign policy. Now, my job is to talk about the first and to talk about it in an institutional context, and I will try to link it a little bit as I go along with what the very good suggestions Ambassador Pickering made. This is my conference week, so yesterday I was at West Point delivering a very short paper about how the size of the NSC staff had gotten, I thought, way out of hand. So we can talk about that at the Q&A if you want. I won't repeat that speech, but I want to basically talk very quickly, sort of spin out 2 sequences. One is talk about Brent's institutional contribution to the structure of the NSC process, and then the second to talk about the informal side. I'll try to do these quickly because I think we can have a lot of Q&A because you have a panel and we have a very good chair. Okay, Brent comes, of course, as Professor Sparrow gave us in his wonderful biography. He comes on the White House national security scene in 1973. He becomes the actual national security advisor by title. The main institutional contribution, it seems to me, made then was to normalize things. Henry Kissinger had, for all his greatness, I think intentionally squashed the national security staff. He was boss. Other people were not supposed to, And one of the things I remember interviewing in those early days was that people in the Nixon staff complained that they were deprived of the White House mess, the White House dining room, whereas the people in the previous administration, Johnson, had that. Well, apparently Brent restored that, which is an interesting small thing, but a sensitivity trying to make the staff personally appreciated, personally flexible, link them better to the overall White House. Well, that's not the only thing he did at that period, but I want to jump rather quickly to what Steve Adly talked about in terms of sort of from the Tower Commission, officially the President's Special Review Board, appointed in the wake of Iran-Contra. What he did there, because there were a couple of institutional innovations that really were created in that, came out of that. Steve stressed the fact that Scowcroft protected the NSC at a time when others would say we have to cut it down, we have to make the confirmation process and so forth. But there are also 2 interesting organizational recommendations. One was basically the creation of a principals group to be chaired by the National Security Advisor, and the second, which followed, was a Deputies Committee to be chaired by the Deputy National Security Advisor, and these would be obviously interagency, state, defense, CIA, Joint Chiefs represented, and others as appropriate for the subject. Now, the first recommendation, the Principals Committee ran into a small problem, whose name was George Shultz, because George Shultz, I sympathize with this view. He felt the Secretary of State is the senior confirmed foreign policy official. It's wrong on an official committee for him to be subordinate to the National Security Advisor. So when Frank Carlucci, the financial security advisor brought in to rescue the system in 1987, got President Reagan to sign off on a new executive order which created this committee. George Shultz made it clear, I'm quite happy with having schmoozing sessions, I'm happy with, meeting informally in the White House, but I'm not going to go to principals committee meetings because that is not. So it's sort of in a sense, a rocky start for the formal relationship, although at the same time, the informal relationship turned out to be increasingly good in that administration. And, but the form was set, and it really flourished in the Bush administration. Basically, you had the Principals Committee, which was well established, and you had the Deputies Committee, which under Bob Gates in its first 2 years really went to town and really conducted a very effective operational role. The fact that Gates himself had a personal relationship with the president was enormously helpful, because if they were having a meeting in the White House, there was a question, he could say, well, give me a few minutes, I'll check that out. And you see him walk upstairs into the president's office, so I'm told. I guess President Bush can confirm or deny this. And so it was a very good way to link operationally to bring in that level of government to handle a lot of issues. And because I'm told that because President Bush himself was so engaged at the principals level, in fact, the Principals Committee per se didn't meet as much as it might have otherwise, but the structure was established, the role of the National Security Advisor as the leader. The other thing that was interesting, though, institutionally, was that that certain groups were established ad hoc when it was clear that the formal structure didn't handle them that well. One example, which was interestingly called, I guess because it was supposed to be secret, was called the Ungroup, which dealt with arms control, partly because most of the Scowcroft aside, most of the sub-cabinet principals were not that versed in arms control. Arnie Cantor, my late wonderful friend, was the head of that, and they, it was a very productive group which brought together the chief arms control related officials of the different agencies to plan. When there was things in Europe were either falling apart or coming together, depending on how you describe it, in the revolutionary events of 1989 and early 1990, there was some uncertainty, some friction in terms of relations between the Scowcroft staff and the State Department. And they created something called the European Security Strategy Group. And because the State Department had several voices, they said, okay, well, they won't just have one State Department. We'll have, I told me, we had 4. And so you had maybe that's reflects well or not so well in the State Department, but what it did do was it brought the right people in, and it quieted concerns, it quieted complaints, so that people, and when we did as Ivo and I ran, before we wrote our book, we ran a number of oral history roundtables of the National Security Council. One was the Bush administration, and that was really unique in the conversation people had in the sense of how cooperative, how collegial things were. Okay, so those are that's something about the structure. But of course, as Ambassador and others have pointed out, process is in the end people. And for the national security process, that means the National Security Advisor and the people around him and how he plays his role. Now, one of the advantages, I guess, of being at this conference at West Point yesterday is we had lunch listening to the interesting reflections of Henry Kissinger, who is still quite interesting at age 93 or so, or 90 or so. One of the things he sort of said in passing, people asked him about the national security process under Richard Nixon, and he said, well, theoretically, it is better to use the Scowcroft model. And, in a sense, he said that grudgingly, but what he was doing was admitting that he wouldn't, and as he did quite honestly in his in the first volume of his memoirs, that was not, that the model that he used was not a good model. It was, but of course it was person related, it was Nixon related, it was Kissinger related in terms of how they operated, but it was not, anyway. So what is the Scowcroft model? Now, Ivo and I reached the conclusion that Brent had sort of a winning formula for how, and it included a few things that included a low public profile, not pushing himself forward. He did appear on talk shows more when he had the job in the Bush administration than he had during the Ford administration, but he didn't push himself. He didn't compete in that way with the Secretary of State. And he didn't give, unlike some others who shall go nameless, he didn't give public advice to the president. Particularly, that was at least that was contrary to what the president was already doing and saying. There were basically three elements of this model, of this Scowcroft winning formula. The first, which is the foundation for everything, well, they're all foundation, but one, win the trust of your colleagues. Build relationships with your colleagues. He said in a separate roundtable we had just for national security advisors, he said, you have to spend the first 12 to 18 months gaining the confidence of the Secretary of State, the Secretary of Defense. You have to show them you're working for them. You have to show them they can trust you, that when you go to the president, they'll represent you fairly, that you won't stand in their way of going to the president, that you will bring them into, you will clearly bring them as full partners, you'll respect them, the whole ball of wax. And James Baker, for all his closeness to President Bush, necessarily had some anxiety about Scowcroft being in the White House and sitting, that close and so forth, and he went out of his way to ameliorate that, to deal with that. Same with Dick Cheney in the Pentagon. So he worked very hard, particularly in the early months, to win the confidence, to win the trust of his colleagues. Secondly, he because of this, he was able to build a process at multiple levels of trust. If the top people are fighting, almost certainly the lower people are going to fight too, because they care about what the top people are fighting about, because they have to support them, and because they're inclined, the natural sort of structural inclination is to pursue the views of your own agency or your own job, because you think that's the way you advance the interests of the United States and make it a better world. So if you don't have the example of cooperation at the top, it's very much harder for, the first W. Bush administration was an example where you had such a bad relationship between the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense that sort of spilled over. Similarly, actually, the first Reagan administration had the same problems in terms of poor relations between. Well, this case, because you had good relations at the top, you could build it down further. And a lot of close cooperation, say when you got into the changes in Europe, changes in Germany. Lots has been written about this. I won't go through it substantively, but very, very close interaction between the state people and the NSC people. And similarly, the war, as moving up to the war in Iraq, the immediate response. And so that was the sort of second level of cooperation. I could give more examples, but let me move on because we want to have a time for discussion. The third thing, of course, is get close to the president and stay close. As several people have already said, the National Security Advisor's single constituent in the end is the president. Now that shouldn't be taken too far. When McGeorge Bundy wrote an op-ed in 1980 criticizing implicitly at least, the Carter administration's process, he said essentially the National Security Advisor should work for the Secretary of State as well as for the president. That these guys are very busy, they can get out of sync, that he has to keep them out of sync, keep them in sync. keep them knowing what each other are thinking, particularly keep the Secretary of State knowing where the President is. So, but nevertheless, the President relationship is key. Fortunately, that was not a big problem for Brent Scowcroft and President Bush, because they sort of started that way. Unlike some other situations where the advisor meets the president anew, more or less, they had long relationship, long trust already. But it also requires a kind of a combination of deference and assertiveness, which is, I think, Scowcroft provided an unusual balance. Deference, I'm reminded in a different context, Dean Acheson, in writing about the Secretary of State's role, said, it is for the relationship between the Secretary and the President to prosper, it is critical from first to last that each understand which is the President. And he cited a famous post-war example of James Burns, who was the Secretary of State, who Truman had kind of worshipped as a politician, who Burns clearly thought really he should be the president, and it didn't work. Any case, Brent clearly understood which was the president. At the same time, that didn't mean he didn't push back if he needed to. Now, an example we give in the book, which as I say, since the president is here, I hope it was true, is that Saddam invades Kuwait. Surprise. People don't expect it. It's August. You pull the National Security Council together, have a meeting. And apparently it was kind of an unfocused, unsatisfactory meeting. People were talking about different things. Baker was wondering, well, can we really do too much about this? And so Scowcroft sort of sits there, and then after the meeting, he tells the president, Mr. President, this wasn't good. This is really very important for us to get this right, and we really have to have a tough response. This is an epical event. This is going to define and shape. People say he doesn't have a vision. Well, maybe not longer, but he knew that this was a shaping event, and how you responded to this was critical to keeping order and keeping the rules of the road correctly in the post-war world. And so he basically gives the pitch to the president about so the president says, okay, you're right, I'll say that at the next meeting. And then Brent says, according to the story we heard anyway, no, don't you say it, Mr. President, because if you say it, everybody will just sit back, and they won't necessarily be persuaded, but they won't argue with you. So let me say it, and then see how people react, but you can obviously support it at the end. So that's what happened. The second meeting essentially paved the way for what was an enormously effective response, first with economic sanctions, and then when that didn't work, with military action. But I think, and at that point, Scowcroft had reached the level of confidence with his colleagues, with his peers, that he could be more assertive on policy without breaking the relationships, while maintaining their confidence. And I think that was critical. Let me stop there, and we'll respond to questions.
Okay. Thanks to both Ambassador Pickering and Professor Destler. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here on the program with you. And of course, an honor and a pleasure to have President and Mrs. Bush here with us today, as well as a number of other distinguished guests. We've heard a lot of great presentations so far this morning, not just from my two colleagues here, but kicking it off with Stephen Adly, and then Bartholomew Sparrow on a more personal take on the history of, experiences of Brent Scowcroft. One of the things that struck me about Ambassador Pickering's remarks was, he just said a few words